here on the Scotch-Irish farm at the Frontier Culture Museum of Virginia in Stanton, Virginia. And today I'm going to be making haggis. Our Scotch-Irish farm here at the museum represents the lives of people who had come to Ireland, Northern Ireland especially, beginning in the early 17th century. They were tenant farmers in Western Scotland and northern Western England. They left their tenant farms behind and they ended up in Northern Ireland, where they are once again tenant farmers. They're paying rent for the house that they live in and for the land that they farm. You may be wondering, why haggis on a Scotch-Irish farm? That's a good question. The first thing I'll say is that haggis is not just Scottish. I know, everybody thinks it's just Scottish, but that's not the way it goes. What haggis is a dish made from bits and pieces of meat that would not be enough to feed a family. But you can stretch those bits of meat with things like oats, and you can throw in an onion, and some spices, and some broth. And by the time you've stretched it that way, you have enough for a whole family to eat, maybe for more than one meal. It's a little bit like meatloaf that way. It's a little bit of meat and a lot of other stuff, right? Here in the United States, we have something very similar, often called scrapple. Here in the valley, it's called panhas, as well as being called panhas in parts of Pennsylvania. In the German-speaking parts of Europe, they have salmagen, which is a stuffed pig's stomach. And there are other dishes like that around the world. It's basically a food for poor people. Little bits of meat stretched with a bit of grain of some sort, and then you feed your family. You might be wondering how haggis came to be so strongly associated with Scotland. I think that we can lay that blame at the feet of a man named Robert Burns. Robert Burns was a poet who lived in the 18th century in Ayrshire in Scotland. That would be just a little south of Glasgow. Robert Burns was a tenant farmer, just like our folks here. He wrote poetry, but it wasn't the same kind of poetry that the upper class were writing. He wrote poetry for the common people, about the common people. Well, it might have been for the upper class. They certainly liked it. But once upon a time in Robert Burns's life, he got together with friends in Edinburgh for a dinner at a tavern. And the landlady of the tavern prepared a meal for them. And the meal that she prepared included haggis. And because of that dinner and the haggis that they had for supper, he wrote a poem called Address to the Haggis. And it's all about how much better the traditional hearty foods of Scotland are compared to those fancy Frenchified dishes, things like fricassees. That poem became very popular very quickly. Robert Burns passed away not too many years after that, and within just a couple of years, his friends and fans were holding Burns suppers in his memory. And the suppers always included haggis, in part because of his poem. Robert Burns is famous for other reasons as well. I'm not going to go into that right now. You can visit our museum website and listen to a podcast which has a bit more of the history of haggis and some more information about Robert Burns. So what is haggis anyway? And why do so many people hear the word and just automatically turn their noses up at it and refuse to taste it? Well, let's talk about that for a minute. First, I'll say that the recipes for haggis show up in cookbooks as early as the 17th century, probably before that, and I haven't found them yet. and on up into modern day cookbooks. So there are lots of recipes or receipts for haggis. The haggis I make is basically my own recipe. I've been making haggis for about many years, and I've kind of developed my own. I get tips and suggestions from people who are usually Scottish and usually men and usually really like haggis and are trying to help me improve my haggis. So what goes into haggis? First of all, the unobjectionable parts. Herbs and spices. Quite a variety. Parsley, sage, rosemary, thyme, mace, salt, pepper. And then the interesting parts. Oats. Now these are ground oats, not rolled oats. Ground oats that were toasted before the fire. It brings out sort of a nutty taste. At least that's what everybody says. Onions. I like onions in my haggis a lot. There's a little bit of suet in the haggis. Suet is animal fat. Specifically, it's the fat that surrounds the internal organs in the belly, basically, of an animal. In this case, I have beef fat. There's also different kinds of meat, as I mentioned earlier. I have sheep's liver, sheep's heart, and, as most of the recipes call for, a piece of good beef. So that's what's in there. It's been boiled and ground up. I saved the liquid, the broth, from boiling the meat to add to the mixture to make it wet enough to cook well. I also have a little bit of wine. A lot of the recipes call for wine. In my book, the more wine, the better. And this will all get mixed together in this bowl, and I'll use my hands for that. And then I have several small sections of sheep's stomachs here. Instead of making one large haggis today, I'm going to make several small ones. As far as for why people turn their nose up at haggis, I think there's two reasons. One is the liver. A lot of people don't like the taste of liver. I find that sheep's liver is a milder taste than beef liver, and I use sheep's liver. I like it better. And of course, everybody turns up their nose at the idea of the stomach. Well, even in prehistoric times, people were using animal stomachs as cooking containers. It works. If you don't have a stomach, you can use basically a pudding cloth. Haggis is, after all, a pudding, right? Sausages are puddings as well. This is a very small pudding cloth, but you would wet this pudding cloth down, sprinkle some flour over it so it acts as a bit of a water barrier, tie it up around whatever it is you're cooking, drop it down into the pot of boiling water, which is exactly what I'll do with my mini sheep's stomachs. So I'm going to put the first bit of ingredients in with the meat right now. This is the chopped onion. And I think I'll go ahead and put the oats in. My recipe calls for the same amount of oats as meat. My experience also calls for that. So this is about a quart of meat and a quart of toasted oats. And I'm going to mix it all up right now. And I'm going to use my hands because it is cold in this room and this meat is stiff. I'm just going to mix it together with my hands. It's a little bit like kneading bread. So that's mixed well enough for right now. For now, let's take a look at the suet. Get these out of the way. I was talking earlier about suet being the internal fat. It's very different fat, or different kind of fat, than you find under the skin. It's more like globules of fat, and it's held together by a very, very thin layer of tissue. And when you cook with it, for instance, to make pastry, you need to pull away that membrane, that very fine membrane, from the globules of fat, or it'll end up in the pastry and make it not work very well as pastry. The difficulty with this is that you have to do this in a cold room, which makes this room pretty perfect. The only problem is really that your hands are also cold, and it's very difficult to make them work. But if you try to do this in a warm room, the fat itself begins to soften up so much that you can't hold on to it and you can't peel it apart. So this is a historic activity that nobody in their right mind actually enjoys doing. I'll just say that. So this looks like a good piece of membrane here, so just kind of watch here as I pull it apart and try not to drop it. I certainly wouldn't want that in my pastry, and I don't want it in my haggis either. Ugh, look at that. Ugh. Fortunately, I have some suet already ready. I knew it was going to be cold in here, and I wasn't going to be able to do this in this room very happily at all. It also takes a long time. This kind of suet is very cool, though. If you go to the market looking for suet in the modern world, you might have to use other words. You might use the word leaf fat. You might use the word kidney fat. Your modern day butchers otherwise will just give you the plain fat from under the skin. It doesn't have those little globules in it. It's a very different kind of fat structurally. This is a hard fat. Just in case you're curious, different kinds of fats from different animals have different names. Lard is fat from a pig. Tallow is fat from a sheep or a cow. In the case of a cow, it's beef tallow. In the case of sheep, it's mutton tallow. Of those three fats, lard, beef fat, or beef tallow, and mutton tallow is the hardest and melts at the highest temperatures. A candle made out of mutton fat would do really well even in warm weather. A candle made out of beef tallow would not be a candle you want to use in the summertime, and don't even try to make candles out of lard. They just won't last. If you want to make soap, beef tallow is probably the best choice. That's just an extra bit of information. All right, so the suet is in there, the oats are in there, the meat is in there, in this bowl. Beginning to think I should have had a bigger bowl, but I guess this will be all right. Now I'm going to wipe the dust off. Never know, never know. Now I'm going to put in some spices, or some seasonings rather. This is the parsley. I'm going to put in about 4 spoonfuls. This is a big spoon. You might call this a tablespoon. You can't have too much parsley. Old receipts and housewives of the past didn't have standard measurements like we do today. Our tablespoon measure is based on a spoon like this. And it could be shaped differently. It could be different sizes, sort of. A big spoon. This was a tablespoon. This was the spoon that you would eat with at the table. This would be a teaspoon. It would be the one that you would stir your tea with. These two different sized spoons just indicated in a receipt to a housewife whether she wanted more of something or less of something. Okay? But it was also up to the cook to just kind of decide what she needed. Now for the sage, I'm going to put in about a tablespoon of sage. Just a pinch of the rosemary, because it's pretty strong and overpowering. About a tablespoon of the thyme. And about a teaspoon or more of the mace. You might be wondering what mace is. It's not a very common spice these days. Mace is the outer covering of the nutmeg. If you've seen a whole nutmeg, it looks kind of like a short, fat pecan. But if you saw the whole thing, it would have a sort of a thin, leafy sort of coating, kind of reddish in color, and that's the mace. It looks a bit like seaweed if you crack it off of the nut itself, and then you grind it up. It's an interesting flavor, and it's a kind of a characteristic seasoning. Nutmeg and mace both are a characteristic seasoning for meats in the 17th and 18th centuries. Pepper is wonderful. I recently discovered a lot of pepper is really nice in haggis. So I put a lot of pepper in. And some salt, and then we're ready to mix it up. Mix those up a little bit. Now wine. And the final ingredient is the broth. This, remember, is the liquid that I boiled the meat in. This is always messy, kind of wonderfully messy. the suet that is in this mixture is not melted yet, but as this cooks, the suet will melt, and that'll add a little bit more liquid to this mixture. Cooking the haggis in the stomach means that no liquid will be introduced into this mixture, or very little, through the wall of the stomach. If I was cooking this haggis in my pudding cloth, I would not want to add so much water to the mixture because water can flow freely through the pudding cloth. If, on the other hand, I was cooking this in a modern day stove, I would want it to be a bit wet because it will dry out in the oven, number one, and because there won't be any extra liquid coming into it in the oven. So if you're going to do something like this at home in the stove, it probably wants to be pretty wet. This is a fairly small mixture here. The liver that I had to use was a bit smaller than usual, probably from maybe a 6-month-old lamb. I think that's probably pretty good consistency. There we have it. The haggis is all mixed up. So when I say that haggis is a pudding, that's kind of more obvious here, isn't it? It's a little sloppy. It's also going to be boiled in water, and that kind of makes it a pudding as well. Now, it's time for me to organize the stomachs. So here's a little stomach with a fairly obvious hole in it. And I've got a needle and some thread. Wet thread is really fun. Trying to catch the end. Got it. A simple knot will pull right through the side of the stomach. So don't do that. This is not high fine sewing. It's just enough to pull the edges of the hole together. I think that this hole is one of the passageways between the guts. I'm not sure if it's from this section of the stomach to the next or what, but I don't think this is just a careless butcher. I think this was a channel of some sort. It got cut. But oftentimes there are knife cuts somewhere on the stomach that have to be mended. One year I made a haggis with a big stomach, and it had 2 cuts on it, and I sewed it together with dark thread. I like to be able to see where the holes are once they're sewed together so that I can make sure that I've done what I was supposed to do and just know where the holes are. And so this one year there were 2 holes, and I was using dark thread, and I didn't really pay attention at first, but when the haggis came out of the pot and I set it in the bowl to drain, I looked down and the 2 holes had been sewn into 2 arched eyebrow shapes. So when we served the haggis that year at a Burns supper, I got some of the big googly eyes and I stuck it onto the side of the haggis underneath the eyebrows. It was pretty funny looking. I don't think they would have done that in the 18th century, but it was pretty funny. We named that Haggis Harry. Remember, I poke holes in the stomach with a needle. So this incision here, this mended place, doesn't have to be airtight. As a matter of fact, it's okay if it's not airtight. I just don't want the pudding to ooze out through the opening. Not a great work of art here, but sufficient for a haggis. So there is my mended stomach hole. I've cleaned up a bit after mixing up the haggis pudding, and I've sorted through the 5 stomachs that I have, and I'm ready to fill one of them, the one that has the smallest damage to it. What I have here are one section of a sheep's stomach. 5 different sheep involved here. A sheep's stomach is in 4 sections. They're ruminants, like a cow, so they chew their food, it goes down in, it moves around from one stomach to the next, and at some point it goes back up into the cow's mouth and they chew it again. The cow's mouth and the sheep's mouth, and they chew it again, and then it travels on down through the system. So this is one of the smaller sections of the sheep's stomach. If you want to make a big haggis, you can use the big part of the sheep's stomach. But when I acquire the stomachs, I always save the small ones because sometimes it's fun to make a mini haggis. So that's what I'm going to do today. So I'm going to try to hold the maw of the stomach, the mouth of the stomach open here, and try to get haggis into the stomach rather than outside the stomach. Easier said than done, I'll say. It's a very sloppy process, this. Oh, that was good. If I'm doing a large stomach, it's very definitely a 2-person job. Can't fill it completely full. The oats that are in this mixture will swell as they soak up the moisture, the liquid. The stomach will stretch up to a point. But once this is all down into the boiling water, the stomach itself will get cooked, and it'll kind of come out with the texture of leather. So I can only use the stomach once for cooking. Can't use it again. I think that's about all. You don't want to fill the stomach completely full, partly because I have to have a place to tie it up to make sure that it does what it needs to do. So I'm going to, I have different tricks with tying it up. I do different things every year. Try this one this time. The thing you don't want is for the stomach to come untied. Sometimes it's nice to have a second set of hands when you do this. So here comes my second set of hands. So if you hold the top part right there. I think you can let go now. Pull it as tightly as I can. Wrap it around. Tie it again. This is not a very heavy haggis. It's small, doesn't weigh too much. I think that's probably fine. I'm going to tie a loop at the top in case I decide I need to suspend this little haggis from the S-hook that the pot is hanging on, just in case this sinks to the bottom of the pot and doesn't come back up again. I don't want it to stick to the bottom of the pot where it might burn. Now the final step I need to do, are we boiling yet? Yes. Needs to be a rolling boil, and it needs to stay a rolling boil. Which is the reason why you don't really want to do this on your kitchen stove at home. It makes one heck of a mess. It does. Take my needle, poke some holes into the stomach to allow air to escape as it cooks. It's kind of gloppy on the outside because I was messy when I put the stuff on the inside. So here goes. It's floating so far. There's a big bubble of air in there which will eventually go away. So our haggis is done. 3 pretty little round ones there, and a very small one here. So how do you serve a haggis? Well, remember, we don't eat the stomach. So you take a knife, and you're going to just slit through the stomach and slit through a couple of places maybe. I think my knife is dull. Ouch. And the haggis is hot. And there's the haggis. Meat. The inside of the haggis is what you eat. It's a little hot right now. If you read Burns's address to the haggis, there's a line where he basically says, you cut you up with a slice with a nice sharp, they use a dirk in the poem, which is a Scottish weapon, a sharp pointed knife kind of weapon. And then there's a comment about how it gushes out, steaming, and it's definitely steaming and it's sort of gushing. And now I'm going to have a little taste of it using my knife here, just to see what I think about it. Yep, it's haggis. Pretty livery taste, but not too bad. So I didn't have enough stomach for the filling, to have some extra filling here. This can go into an oven and be baked just like a casserole. You can use a modern oven, or you could do this in an old-fashioned bake oven, like for baking bread, if you happen to have one in your house. I do think the traditional way is to use the stomach. So, there's your story about haggis and why we want to eat it. Remember, liver contains a lot of iron. Happy Burns Day.